Yeah, hello everybody. Just so you know, I barely see anybody because the light is on me. But anyways, so I mean, we have been hearing a lot about decentralization as a great thing, and often I would always say it's a good thing. It goes with the whole peer-to-peer thing that we should all be able to connect to each other directly. But there's a difference between decentralized, which is a kind of a fixed state where you can say something is decentralized or not. So in the case of blockchains, for example, whenever somebody comes up with a new protocol or a new idea, there's always the controversy and a lot of discussion around, is it decentralized enough? And somebody will find out, no, it's not, and there will argument and controversy around that. So instead of looking at decentralized, which is, the idea that everything is not decided at the same place, like everybody has an equal share, at least they have some kind of direct interaction with the system. A more interesting way to look at it is as the process of getting there, actually. So, and this is why I'm looking at like how we get to decentralization and what are some of the kind of paradoxes that come about. So, if you think about, say Bitcoin. So when Bitcoin was started by Nakamoto, all by himself, he was the only person doing it, hashing and then mining the first few blocks, and then Hal started joining him, and they did that. So initially, it was only him and another person, pretty centralized. But if he wanted to make a truly decentralized system, and he said, you know what, it's not going to be just me and somebody else. I'm going to wait for enough people to join the network to even start the network. The people having like pledging that I will start mining it. But if he wanted to wait to have a critical mass for it to be enough decentralized, he would never end up starting it. And this is a general paradox that you see, like even when you say download the Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever. In the case of Bitcoin, you have the six seed nodes, which you can always know would be the actual Bitcoin. So, for example, today if an alien came and asked you that I want to connect to this Bitcoin thing, but I don't want to trust anybody telling me where to get the correct Bitcoin. I want to verify even where to get the Bitcoin. You'll be like, there is no way to do it. I mean, you have to ultimately trust somebody to tell you which is the right Bitcoin, because somebody could start their own Bitcoin, have like all kinds of Bitcoin, but actually they control it, so you don't know that. So ultimately, to bootstrap or even to fork a network, like when Ethereum was forked, like after the DAO hack, there was Vitalik, who was kind of like the hard fork manager, coordinating and proposing. And if you want that to be decentralized, if you want everybody in the community suggesting a fork, then you need some way to build a platform where everybody suggests a fork. And if there is no one doing it, then there's no centralization, but then there will be no way to ask a vote. So you need a Vitalik to do that. So at the very beginning, you always need be it of a fork or starting a new network, some minimum centralization to at least get to a point where it's like enough people. And that's why you have this kind of a dance that you see in all these kinds of networks where even if it is centralized at the beginning, if it does what it aims to do, like in the case of Bitcoin, you get some level of decentralization. But even when it gets decentralized, in the case of Bitcoin, very soon certain mining pools started happening, and then like right now 6 main mining pools control the network. So you would think it again got centralized after a while, but at the same time, it is not centralized because within the mining pool, it's a pool. So it's not a single person mining it. There are many people who are submitting part of the nodes. And so that gets into a single mining pool. So it went from initially centralized, Nakamoto and only Hal, and then became decentralized, people mining and not just Hal, others joined, and then became again centralized with the mining pools, and then again became decentralized because more and more people started joining the pools, so the pools itself were not a single entity. And this you see in regular networks. So, for example, if you look at, say, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church for most of history was pretty centralized, and the way it decided what should be the message and everything. But as it scaled to not just Europe, but to every part of the world, it could not reach every single church and enforce whatever it had. So it led to kind of fragmentation, and individual churches like in Latin America or Caribbeans, they combine a lot of like different traditions, the local traditions or traditions from Africa. And so automatically to evolve any network, it goes from these kinds of kind of a yin yang, kind of like a dance. So that's why it's really a process. It's not a thing in itself. So that's why decentralization is actually a mix of both, like centralized and decentralized, and within each other. And it's more of a movement, a spectrum. It's not a single thing where it's like either this or that. But then the question is, what are the kind of decisions when we know that has to be centralized sometime, it will come inevitably if something scales and something survives, then how can we decide what could be centralized and not? So one way of looking at it is, say, the examples that I gave of hard fork. When you do a hard fork, it's a matter of high importance because it can make or break the network. It can change the value definition of a network. And you know that this requires enough specific skill and competence. Not everybody is technically or legally competent enough to understand how to go about changing the software, how to go about coordinating, how to go about legitimizing the process. So this leads to a certain kind of centralization where people who are capable of doing that does that. So even in the case of regular, not just hard for regular use of the Bitcoin or Ethereum, people who are really, like, not everybody theoretically can become a miner, but not really, because you need first, you need to be competent to know how to run a mining rig and all of that. And apart from that, you need a lot of financial resources to be able to even have your own mining pool or your mining equipment. And then people who actually run the full node, you need much less competence to do that. But at the same time, you need to know a bit of how to run your own full node. You have to know either how to use the terminal or something like that. And people who have even less competence, they're okay to just use some, delegate their trust to somebody else, like an expert, in the case they think the Coinbase is an expert for them. So they let Coinbase do everything. So at the same time, even when you are not competent and you let Coinbase do your thing, if it's a matter of high importance, so for example, when you have, say, 1 Ether, it's okay to do that. But when you have 1,000 Ethers, because it's of high importance, even if you're not competent, you are not okay giving it out to somebody else to do that. You would not be comfortable deferring it to an expert. Then it really becomes a matter of, if it's important enough, then you end up learning by yourself, reading tutorials or something, or you end up putting restrictions on the expert. So you say, you make a contract saying if you lose over a certain amount, like we do in custodian services, you will have to pay up or something like that. So they bear the risk of what they're doing. It's just not you are able to give it to them. So it's always a matter of the importance of something coupled with the competence that you need. So high importance and high competence, centralization is usually what happens. And this is what happened in the examples that I gave. Like at the beginning, it was highly important and you needed very competent to start the first blockchain in the world. So you had centralization. But then later, when it became more easy to just join the network, anybody could install the software, it became more and more decentralized. So that's why your centralization is not my centralization, which means that how we decide what is of high importance and what needs competence depends on person to person. So for example, for some people, it's not that important to have the actual upgrades of the software. So that's why they are okay to delegate it to certain companies who take care of that. Or even in terms of like political, like the regular socio-political atmosphere, there are often debates on which part of the economy should be decentralized. It depends on what they think is important. For some people, the tax system is very important, and that's why that should be decentralized. We should neoliberalize it, and startups could do some reports on that. Or some people think, no, tax is not that important. We should have some other department, like say education should be decentralized. So even if you consider that something is of high importance and highly competence needed, you need decentralization. It depends, and that's why I said like it's a thing. Like it depends on the person is what, or the institution, what they think is worth high importance and high competence. So that's why the whole debate that happens in blockchain startups and decentralization, even in politics, like right now in France and other parts, like what should and should not be decentralized, how much control should government have, people should have. It's ultimately comes down to a matter of how we evaluate things to have what kind of importance and what kind of competence we need in that. So that's why, so is the answer finally meritocracy, as in a system where you give the right of somebody to make decisions, provided they're able to prove their merit. So they're able to prove they have the competence and they have the capacity to deal with something of high importance. Because you would think, based on this parameter, importance and competence, meritocracy would be a great idea. And in the case of computer science, usually meritocracy is preferred. You look at people's GitHub and you know how good they are, or their blog, their paper, and they get to have the call. They get to make the decision, for example. But at the same time, when you do meritocracy, the problem is always how do you, or who decides like what is important and what I said, what is competent. So for example, for some people it is objectively true, something is remains highly important, or somebody is competent, and in some cases it's not. So, and this happens all the time, that even in cases when a startup decides, okay, now we start a new protocol and we will redistribute our power, burn our tokens or stake or something like that. It is the people who are already in power who can decide how to distribute the power. So that's why they will always do things based on what best they think is the way to distribute power. And that might end up not really distributing power sometimes, or be questionable if it is really distributed. So, and that's why there was a whole debate in Bitcoin scaling, for example, that should the block size be more or less. We were debating what should be, this will lead to more centralization, not, because they were deciding on what should be, how to define what is competence, what is importance. Like, is it important for everybody to be able to use it? Is it competent for everybody to be able to mine it? Is it important that the block size is small, so there could be multiple mining pools instead of few mining pools? Like, what should be more important? And because it could not be a single answer to that, we have, like, Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin and others like that. So that's why meritocracy is the way we think we could address this, the question of how to decide something, or somebody has merit or somebody has competence and something is important, is we might think, okay, this is crypto, we can prove everything. It's like everything is mathematically provable, so we will look for proofs in what people do. So in the case of, say, protocol changes, we will look at if it's like formal verification, if it's true, if the people behind it, they have credibility behind it. And then at the same time, we will make sure that it's not just transparent, that we get to see all the operations, how it's happening, like they don't have important decisions behind the curtain, but everything is published. We will also make it accountable, which means whatever the people in charge do, they will be responsible. So they would have to buy in the stakes of the system. So in a socio-political way, it would be equivalent to, say, Macron, not just living in Elise, but actually living a few days like everybody else and paying taxes like everybody else. So he would really feel, which is not possible to do in actual real world. But in crypto, you can have people have enough stakes, like as if they're also part of the system. Like they are not outside of the system making the decisions for people who are in the system. But then when we try to do that, we realize that decentralization is not always a good idea or a perfect idea, because not everybody is competent to verify the proof of confidence itself. So like it happened recently, like 2 years ago, I think, something that you would think is objectively provable, mathematical proof. So there's a ABC conjecture, which was unprovable conjecture from, I think, 200, 300 years ago. And finally, this one person proved it, the ABC conjecture, and he published the proof in like 1,000 pages or something. But because it was 1,000 pages, there was no other mathematician competent to verify the proof. So ultimately, it became a kind of a social thing that we know this guy is really genius. He publishes paper that nobody understands. He must be saying the truth. And then I think 6 months, 8 months later, two other mathematicians came up and said, we actually read the 1,000 pages, and it is true. Now, you don't know if they just did it for just to get a name out of that. There's really no way of knowing it. And in fact, that initial mathematician was asked, like, can you give us a shorthand way of explaining your proof? He said, if I could have done the proof in a few pages, I would have done it. 1,000 pages is the shortest proof I could have done. That's why it's 1,000 pages. Why would I waste any pages trying to prove something? So even as objective as a mathematical proof, if you need really high competence, there is no way to know that it is actually true or not. So in that case, decentralization becomes really challenging to do that. And then there are many cases where you cannot always put all the stakes measurable or quantifiable. So uh, there was a situation like in Israel, there was a school where the parents were late, and the school tried to have an incentive mechanism where they said, if you're late, you will pay by the hour. Let's say 10 euros you have to pay if you're late. So the parents are not late. And then some of the parents realize that if I get paid more than 10 euros at work, it's more rational for me to be at work than go to school and pick up my kid. I will just pay my way out of not picking up and then when the teachers tried to give them grief, they were like, but I'm paying up for this. You said that's the system. So the problem here was that the the initial feeling of the parents feeling guilty that, oh, I didn't pick up my kid at the right time, this feeling of guilt is a kind of a qualitative feeling, qualitative dimension. And you cannot put a money on the love. But by putting a money on the love, they cheapened it. So it became 10 euros per hour equal. So the better way of approaching that would have been is when to answer a qualitative thing with a qualitative thing, which is that if you are late in school, the teacher could have had a system, you get to have a passive-aggressive teacher insult you for 10 minutes. If you are late 3 hours, they insult you for 30 minutes, and there are two teachers. So that's why something that is qualitative should always be incentivized by something that is qualitative, by making it quantitative. Or let's say if you are invited at my home to have dinner and you all love my food, I make very good curry, actually I do. And then at the end of the meal, I give you 20 euros to thank you for coming. You'll be like, that's weird. Why would you pay me for being your friend? Now, every time I meet you, I incentivize you so you always come. I would end up cheapening our friendship. So things that are qualitative, like friendship or honor or these things, it actually becomes worse the moment you try to measure it and put like numbers to it, because then it becomes a market thing. It becomes much more cheap thing. So on those things, you cannot even do this, the skin in the game. Like, you cannot have a way to enforce that everybody has enough stakes, because some people will have stakes that are like qualitative. And then it's also not a good idea when the accountability is defined by the powerful. So in many cases, in the hope of accountability, some say the manager decides, you know what, I don't want to have all the control. I will have everybody use a project management tool, and everybody, all of us, including me, will put what I'm doing. It'll be transparent. The entire company will be able to see the board and know who is doing what. But then what mostly happens is, because the manager defined and asks everybody to use the tool, manager sometimes skips doing it out of really being busy. But because everybody is under him, cannot really speak up and say, but we are all putting our schedule, but you're not. So it ends up becoming another tool for surveillance, and it's not a good idea. So in many cases, when the powerful decide how to redistribute the stakes, change it, it becomes really problematic. And so that's why this is what I call the Politburo paradox. So in Russia, after the Marxist revolution, when they had a temporary party, and which is the Politburo, the meeting of that party, the whole idea of it was that the power and the existence of the party will be proportional to the disparity in wealth in the country. So the more equal people become, the less powerful the party will become. To the point when there's complete equality, the party will vanish. So that was the whole point of the party. But because the party were constantly measuring how equal, unequal, they realized it is their incentive to their desire to survive to always say it's not equal enough. And it was never equal, and it was 70, 80 years, and now it doesn't exist. So that's why when you have a mechanism, and this is like a classic thing, very popular in DAO-ish kind of things in the crypto world, where you have different companies doing blockchain and says, we will are a DAO, we will destroy our coins. Some people do destroy our coins, but if you really look in the microprints and everything, it becomes really questionable that how they are the ones who have started it and have all the power or more power, decide to give up that power. I'm not saying you cannot do that, but it's a process, and you have to be aware of initially what I said, that it will always go from centralized to decentralized, decentralized to centralized. So that's why this leads to new forms of power, not always bad, but we have to be careful of this. So that's why the second paradox that happens, also happened in Russia and other places, is when the leftists, left is usually defined as the ones who are rebelling and the right are the ones in power. If you look at that way of looking at it, then the people who are revolting from the left, once they take over power, they are the powerful, they are the right. And if they are the right, you need the new left to again oust the right. So that's why revolutions, by way of decentralizations, are kind of a force of nature, kind of a process, kind of something that can never end, because as I was saying that the attempt to decentralization leads to little pockets of centralization, but we should not stop there. We should keep revolting to have more decentralization, to have more centralization, to have more. So it goes on and on and on. So it's like a yin yang. So that's it.